We're continuing with Chapter 8 of The Ultimate Evil, an investigation of America's most dangerous satanic cult by Maury. Sam sleeps. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him. A crowd of several hundred frenzied New Yorkers chanted outside a Brooklyn courthouse as Berkowitz was arraigned and held for psychiatric testing. Later, at Kings County Hospital, another throng shouted for the immediate execution of the alleged son of Sam. Telephoned death threats swamped the hospital's switchboard, and 5 young men were arrested in the outdoor melee, suspected of plotting to put a bomb inside the large medical center. Upstairs, in a small cell in the prison ward, a heavily guarded Berkowitz paced the floor. In another wing of the hospital, Robert Violante lay quietly, still recovering from his blinding head wound. It was now Friday, August 12th, and a 48-hour immersion in the media left me resigned to the belief that there would be a difficult, if not impossible, mountain to scale if I sought to resolve any questions about Berkowitz's sole guilt. But I was determined to give it a try. After compiling the initial information about the Carr household, I followed a hunch about the John Wheaties alias and phoned around to find someone who knew the family. Since I'd grown up in Yonkers, I was able to obtain referrals, and after about 5 calls, I located a contact who was acquainted with them. The conversation was revealing, but by the time it ended, my adrenaline was working overtime. You're right. It's more than a phone listing. John Carr's nickname was Wheaties, I was told. The contact, whom I will call Jack, added, the nickname may have originated with the listing, which was probably a number for both John and Wheat when they were kids. Old man Sam runs an answering service, so there's a lot of lines into that house. They probably just never changed it in the book, Jack suggested. Based on what you're telling me, John Carr was an alias of Son of Sam. I said slowly, that's heavy stuff. Well, his nickname was Wheaties, Jack replied. But how could Berkowitz, if he wrote that Breslin letter, know John Carr's nickname if he didn't know the Carrs? I asked. He says he didn't. They say he didn't, and he's supposed to be this loner with no friends anywhere. He's only in that neighborhood since last year, not all his life, and he's the original Herman's hermit. So how does he know the nickname of someone he doesn't even know? Jack added some more fuel. John doesn't even live in New York anymore. He's back and forth a lot, but he's been in the Air Force for years. He's somewhere in the Dakotas, last I heard. That's even more curious. Now he knows the nickname of a guy who's only around here sporadically. What do you know about this Carr's studio in that house? Nothing, but I'd guess that's Michael. He's some sort of designer, I think. Jack knew little else, except that John was about 30 and Michael about 5 years younger. I think you're raising some interesting questions, but Berkowitz says he was alone, and so do the cops. I know. I don't know where this is leading, if anywhere, but they do have him convicted already. I've been reading the papers. Indeed, I'd been absorbing every detail I could in the aftermath of the arrest. Pages and pages of newspaper reports and countless minutes of television and radio time had successfully transmitted the official message to the nation. Crazy David Berkowitz heard a barking dog and killed for his master Sam. There were many myths published about Berkowitz in the weeks following his apprehension. For instance, it was widely reported that the arrest halted him as he prepared to drive to the Hamptons to shoot up a discoith? Is Is that the proper name for a disco? To shoot up a disco-eth with his semi-automatic rifle and go out in a blaze of glory. This story was leaked by police officials and immediately bannered in hundreds of headlines. It was false. Berkowitz said he'd driven to the Hamptons the weekend before his capture, thought about shooting up a disco, but changed his mind. But the inaccurate story, which did have a grain of truth in it, served a purpose. The NYPD had, in the nick of time, saved many lives. Another item which received widespread publicity held that Berkowitz apparently shot and killed a barking dog behind an apartment building where he lived in the Bronx in 1975. This wasn't true either, according to Building Superintendent James Lynch, who knew Berkowitz at that time. Lynch would tell me in 1984 that a neighbor actually shot the dog, his own dog, at that in a drunken rage one night. Another false story seeping from that same Barnes Avenue address also garnered extensive attention. It involved some threatening notes Berkowitz supposedly slid under the door of an elderly woman because she played her television too loudly. Once again, Lynch told me otherwise. I saw those notes. The woman, she's dead now, showed them to me. She didn't know who wrote them, and neither did anyone else. But if it was Berkowitz, there was nothing threatening about them at all. They were simply polite requests to please try to lower the sound. Small matters? Not really. These are but 3 examples of many which, put together, painted a distorted picture of Berkowitz that made later efforts to uncover the truth even more difficult than it already was. First impressions linger, and in the Berkowitz investigation, reversing them was akin to plowing through a brick wall. The story of the loud television, for instance, appeared in hundreds of newspapers and was included in Newsweek's cover story of the arrest. So, who was David Berkowitz? He was born in Brooklyn on June 1st, 1953, and given up for adoption shortly afterwards. His mother's name was Betty Broder, a Brooklyn resident of the Jewish faith. She had been married years earlier to a man named Tony Falco, who left her sometime later. Betty Broder began a long-term affair with a married Long Island businessman named Joseph Kleinman, also of the Jewish faith. Kleinman, who died of cancer in the early 1970s, never left his wife for Betty Broder Falco, but that didn't impede him from fathering Richard David. Betty, however, already had a daughter, Rosalind, from her marriage to Falco. She couldn't keep her infant son without the willing support of Kleinman, who apparently demurred. And so the baby was put up for adoption. The media reported Berkowitz was half Italian and half Jewish because Tony Falco was listed as the father on the adoption papers. Betty put Falco's name on the document because she knew she couldn't use the married Kleinman's name. So the child was actually 100% Jewish, and was then welcomed into the modest Bronx apartment of Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a childless middle-class couple who lived on Stratford Avenue in the Soundview section. The baby was renamed David Richard Berkowitz. His new father, Nat, owned a hardware store on the Bronx's Melcrose Avenue and worked long hours to maintain his business. He was serious about his faith, and the young David received religious training, was bar mitzvahed, and led a basically normal childhood. David possessed above-average intelligence and was capable of doing well in school when he applied himself. He enjoyed sports, particularly baseball, and cultivated a small circle of childhood friends. In October 1967, when he was 14, his adoptive mother Pearl died of cancer. David loved her deeply, and was hurt greatly by the loss. Thereafter, his relationship with Nat, while cordial, was occasionally strained due to the father's child-rearing attitudes and David's reactions to them. In late 1969, David and Nat moved from Stratford Avenue to a new home in the Bronx, Co-op City, a huge high-rise complex in the eastern area of the borough. There, David, who was attending Christopher Columbus High School, accumulated a new group of friends. Prominent among them were 4 boys his age, some of whom maintained contact with him until his arrest. Berkowitz liked uniforms, joining the auxiliary police at the 45th Precinct in the Bronx in 1970. While still in high school, he was also instrumental in the formation of an unofficial volunteer fire department at Co-op City. By his own admission, his teenage love life left something to be desired. He professed to like girls and said he'd had a few dates, but no relationship, with the exception of one girl named Iris Gerhardt. Berkowitz implied the affair was significant, and it apparently was to him. Iris viewed it as a basically platonic friendship. She reported liking David as a person, and Berkowitz kept in touch with her throughout the early 1970s, writing her frequently after he joined the Army. David graduated from high school in 1971, a few months after his father remarried. David resented the intrusion of his new stepmother, Julia, who had children of her own. One daughter, Anne, had an influence on David's life that, if the story is correct, is shadowed with dark overtones. Berkowitz later wrote that Anne was very interested in the occult. He called her a witch. But with Julia in his life as an unwelcomed stepmother, and Amy suddenly appeared attractive to David, Nat thought his son should attend college. But David opted for the military and enlisted in June 1971, shortly after his high school graduation. David's soldiering career was unremarkable. He was not sent to Vietnam, but did spend a year in Korea. He was later stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky, before being discharged in June 1974. While in the service, he received routine firearms training, achieving a mid-level competency grade as a marksman, and was brought up on minor disciplinary charges twice. While in Korea, Berkowitz said he experimented with LSD on several occasions, as did many of his fellow GIs. The Army did change Berkowitz in one major respect. He was a hawk, but came out an anti-military dove. But it was during his period at Fort Knox, beginning in January 1973, that a symptom of the mindset, which would later leave him susceptible to untoward influences became manifest. Berkowitz, born and raised a Jew, began to attend Beth Haven Baptist Church in Louisville. He said he enrolled in every program and often remained in the church for the entire day. On Sundays, he listened to religious broadcasts, incessantly studied numerous liturgical writings, and began to try to convert his fellow soldiers and some of Kentucky's civilian population from a street corner pulpit. This was fire and brimstone, old-time religion, and when David returned to the Bronx after his discharge in the late spring of 1974, Nat Berkowitz reached for his tranquilizers. His Jewish son was sounding as if he'd just strolled out of a cobweb chapter of The Scarlet Letter. Naturally, David's new beliefs led to some difficulties with Nat. On top of that, David's inner feelings of resentment toward Julia intensified. He needed a place of his own, so, with Nat's help, he located the apartment at 2161 Barnes Avenue and moved there in late 1974, bringing along a fair amount of furniture Nat gave him. David enrolled at Bronx Community College and was hired as a guard at IBI Security, working in Manhattan. He also resumed contact with his friends from Co-op City, several of whom professed to have been put off by his religious proselytizing. In early 1975, Nat Berkowitz retired from his hardware business, and he and Julia retreated to a condominium in Boynton Beach, Florida, and Julia's daughter apparently drifted off to California and became involved with a commune. David, who had philosophically separated from his father months before, was now physically distanced from him as well. The pressure cooker was simmering. The recipe's final seasoning was added in May 1975. David, feeling terribly alone without purpose, began a search for his real parents. He joined ALMA, Adoptive Liberty Movement Association, attended several meetings, and then began his quest in earnest. His David Berkowitz birth certificate led him to the Bureau of Records in New York City, where he discovered his real name was Richard Falco. He then called all the Falcos in the Brooklyn directory and came up empty. An ALMA counselor subsequently steered him to the New York Public Library's collection of old telephone books. He found a Betty Falco in the 1965 Brooklyn edition and learned she was still at the address, albeit with an unlisted number. Berkowitz still wasn't sure this Betty Falco was his mother, but he decided to chance it. On Mother's Day 1975, he stuck a card in her mailbox. It said, "You were my mother in a very special way." He signed it RF for Richard Falco and wrote his phone number on the card. He drove back to the Bronx, nervous, apprehensive, and yet excited at the possibility that he'd last discover who he really was and to be united with the woman who brought him into the world. Since the death of his adoptive mother, Pearl, in 1976, there was a well's worth of emptiness in David, a hollow pit he was desperate to fill. Several days later, Betty Falco called, and mother and son met for the first time since David's infancy. Berkowitz, edgy but hopeful, was ultimately crushed. He learned he was illegitimate, discovered Betty had a daughter, Rosalind. She'd not given up, and absorbed other details about his heritage and Betty that further dismayed him. He never voiced his torment, however. He instead sought to begin and maintain a relationship with Betty, Rosalind's husband Leo, and their young daughters, whom David genuinely adored. He attempted to live a normal life, but the hurts had piled too high. The lid was ready to blow off the now boiling pressure cooker. About 9 months later, in February 1976, Berkowitz inexplicably moved from the Bronx to the private home of the Cassara family in New Rochelle. Superintendent Lynch told me Berkowitz was in the middle of a lease when he left Barnes Avenue. He was also still working in New York City for IBI Security, and his Bronx rent was lower than that in New Rochelle. So on the surface, the move made no sense in terms of reducing his commute or any other reason usually associated with relocation. The Cassaras would tell me they only advertised the room in Westchester newspaper, and Berkowitz never revealed how he came to know about the rental. Regardless, Berkowitz was out of the Cassara house just 2 months later. Much media noise was made of the belief that he suddenly fled the residence because of his aversion to the Cassara's barking German Shepherd dog. Berkowitz may not have appreciated the animal, but he hadn't fled. Records show that he applied for an apartment at 35 Pine Street in Yonkers a month before his move. His application was approved, and he moved into apartment 7E in mid-April. And so another widely reported Berkowitz myth now dies. If Berkowitz's move to New Rochelle was mysterious at first glance, his journey to Yonkers seemed even more curious. This relocation didn't ease his commute either. Pine Street was also off the beaten track, and as such wouldn't be known to a boy from the East Bronx who most recently lived on the opposite side of Westchester County in New Rochelle. Logically, however, Berkowitz certainly must have had some reason for choosing to live in that Northwest Yonkers apartment, where the rent was about $40 a month more than he was paying in Rochelle and nearly $100 higher than his cost in the Bronx. That reason would concern me for quite some time. I had my suspicions, but wouldn't be able to confirm them for several years. In May, incidents of violence erupted in Berkowitz's neighborhood as detailed in Chapter 6. There is no question that Berkowitz was involved in these crimes, but not as a sole instigator or perpetrator. In June, just 2 months after arriving at 35 Pine, Berkowitz visited his father in Boynton Beach, Florida, and then drove on to Houston, Texas, where Billy Dan Parker, his army buddy, purchased a .44 Bulldog revolver for him at a local shop. 6 weeks later, the Son of Sam shootings began. Berkowitz also found new employment in the summer of 1976 as a cab driver in the Bronx, and later as a sheet metal apprentice in Westchester. In March 1977, Berkowitz joined the U.S. Postal Service, having passed the required civil service exam a year earlier. He worked in a large postal facility on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. His hours encompassed the second shift from approximately 3:30 p.m. to midnight. It was his last job. In the New York Post, a recent acquisition of Australian publishing magnate Rupert Murdoch, who was heavily involved in the coverage of the Son of Sam case. At times, it was guilty sensationalism, but so were the rest of the media. The Post was losing money when Murdoch took the reins, and he immediately laid claim to the .44 caliber investigation engaging the Daily News, particularly in a battle of headlines as the probe continued. It was said in New York that Murdoch hung his hat on Son of Sam. 2 weeks after Berkowitz's arrest, I sat in the office of Peter Michaelmore, the Post's metropolitan editor, and elicited his interest in the subject of John Wheaty's car and the car illustration studio. The Post was headquartered at 210 South Street near the seaport, not far from the Brooklyn Bridge. Its city room reflected the paper's financial struggles, which antiquated typewriters and general disarray in evidence. Murdoch had imported a number of Australian writers and editors to work at the Post. People he knew well from his overseas operations. Michael Moore, a distinguished-looking gray-haired man about 50, was one of those. I think this John Carr thing is good stuff, he said, after I explained what I'd discovered. Michael Moore summoned columnist Steve Dunleavy, another Australian, and assigned him to work with me to develop the story. Dunleavy was about 40 and just had written Elvis, What Happened, which would become a bestseller. Elvis Presley had just died, and Dunleavy was fortuitously working on the book with a couple of the King's ex-bodyguards at the time. Dunleavy decided to visit my apartment in White Plains, where we discussed the case at length. "We're going to have a hell of a time with the cops, mate," he warned. "They're not going to like this stuff at all." Dunleavy said that he knocked on Sam Carr's door the morning after the arrest. He had a gun underneath a towel and pointed it right at me. I almost dropped dead on the spot. The cops say there are guns all over that house. I showed Dunleavy the breakdown of the PS in the Breslin letter, we agreed it was on target, but also concurred that its publication would open the door to charges of speculative reporting, which neither of us wanted to endure. The cops will deny this. We need more about John Carr first. Do you know where he is? Dunleavy asked. No, he's just supposed to be somewhere in North Dakota. The meeting ended with an agreement to pursue John Carr. Dunleavy would check his sources in the city. I'd do what I could in Westchester. A week later, I heard from Pete Michaelmore, who asked me to drive to his office for another session. I think we can get on Carr, he said. How? We've got a man in the hospital. In Kings County? You've got access to Berkowitz? Yes, Michaelmore answered, but he didn't reveal who it was. I knew Berkowitz was being guarded closely, segregated from the other prisoners and patients. It's got to be a doctor or a guard or someone like that, I said. That's fantastic. Maybe we can get somewhere. There was an ironic justice in this development. The police no longer had access to Berkowitz, while I, an outsider, suddenly did. Indirectly, at least. But there was no time for self-congratulation. Michaelmore asked me for a list of pertinent questions which the source could put to Berkowitz, one or two at a time. Dunleavy, meanwhile, would use some of my information in a letter he was comprising to the alleged .44 caliber killer. It was agreed that John Carr wouldn't be mentioned in the note. We wanted the hospital source to handle that one personally, so he could observe Berkowitz's immediate reaction. I liked Dunleavy and Michaelmore. Michaelmore was low-keyed and professional. Dunleavy was hell on wheels. He was bright and incisive. My only difficulty was in trying to slow him down. Sometimes it seemed as if Steve's attention span could be measured in nanoseconds. He was also occasionally prone to a headline mentality, an inclination to view everything as it would appear in the 72-point type on page 1. He, on the other hand, believed I was too methodical and too willing to consider fragmented data as relevant to the investigation. Our contrasting traits managed to mesh, however, and we developed a healthy respect for each other. The Village Voice, a Murdoch weekly in New York that was often critical of the Post, once referred to Dunleavy as Son of Steve. I jumped on that label and took to using it in our conversations. Within 3 days of this second meeting at the Post, I sent a list of questions to Michaelmore, primarily subjects where the Son of Sam letters, John Carr and Berkowitz, movements at the Moskowitz Violante shootings. He was supposed to be in the park, I explained to Michaelmore. So what was he doing on Bay 17th Street just before the shots rang out? The contradiction was news to Michaelmore, but I was driving a few of my neighbors crazy with that same question. Several nights after dinner, I'd relax outside my apartment with them. Invariably, the case was discussed. Usually, I'd draw a map in the dirt, showing Berkowitz in the park and Berkowitz on the street at the same time. It's impossible. Something's wrong. Very wrong, I'd say. Tom Bartley, a news editor for Gannett Westchester Rockland newspapers, became Doubting Thomas Bartley. You must have read the Times wrong. There's no way he didn't do it. He'd say over and over, night after night. Bartley's attitude bothered me. Healthy skepticism was one thing, but his demeanor was one of, don't confuse me with any facts. As he was a journalist, I thought his reactions might be more inquisitive than they were. Time and time again, I'd enunciate the discrepancies, but I couldn't reach him. Sooner or later, this thing's going to blow apart, and you and Gannett are going to look foolish, I finally said after 2 weeks of futility elapsed. Berkowitz lives in your circulation area, and nobody up here wants to investigate this. Bartley always had an answer. You haven't shown me anything that's not just some mere coincidence, he'd say, pointing at me with the twig I'd been using to outline the Moskowitz scene on the ground, and after a while my ire would mount and heated debates would erupt. He enjoyed busting your chops, another neighbor cut in one night. Don't fall for it. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. At that moment, the neighbor's dog flopped down on the map. That does it, I shouted. It's a sign from the goddamned demon dog. Berkowitz and his dog, and now yours, I laughed. I give up. He did it alone. Bartley roared. At least he didn't dump on it. He could have, for all it's worth. Well, see, your mule-headed bastard, I replied. Well, we'll see. Tension broken. We switched to something we all agreed on. The lousy season the football giants were certain to have. Bartley, for all his bravado, underwent a slow conversion within a year. He'd become a staunch ally and would later share a byline with me on a series on the case published by Gannett. But until that time, he plied me with some regular doses of frustration. Drawing maps in the dirt wasn't the only crawling around I did while waiting to hear from him. While waiting to hear from the post contact at Kings County satisfied that vital clues were hidden in the Breslin letter, I obtained a copy of the unpublished Borelli note from Michael Moore and began to apply the same crossword association system to that communication. The copy of the book, The Story of the Woodlawn Cemetery, was recovered by police in Berkowitz's apartment. Woodlawn, located in the northeast Bronx, was a beautiful sprawling burial ground landscaped with thousands of trees, running brooks, winding roads, and a swan-populated lake. In studying the Borelli letter, I thought some of its phrases might have hinted at specific grave sites in Woodlawn. Since Berkowitz had the book, it was possible something might be hidden at one of them. Many notable Americans were entombed at Woodlawn, including George M. Cohan, Bat Matterson, F. W. Woolworth, Nellie Bly, financier Jay Gould, Oscar Hammerstein, Damon Runyon, and others. A map available at the cemetery office pinpointed these sites. On 3 successive Saturdays in September, I wandered through Woodlawn with my friend Bob Siegel and his son Larry, rooting around tombstones and mausoleums that possibly were linked to the wording in the letter. By the second weekend, the caretakers began to take notice. These guys must think we had some very important ancestors, Larry cracked, or else they're going to arrest us for grave robbing. Yeah, I answered. The investigation of the body snatchers. The hunt was futile. The analysis was wrong, absurdly wrong, and after a time the beauty of Woodlawn was shrouded by the eeriness of what we were doing. In short order, the great Woodlawn clue caper came to an end. Steve Dunley, meanwhile, was having better luck. Berkowitz answered his letter in a fashion, and the Post made plans to publish it on Monday, September 19th. Acting on the car illustration studio lead, Dunleavy also located a couple of Berkowitz's former friends from Co-op City. Both agreed that the writing ability manifest in the Breslin letter surpassed Berkowitz's, and they stated that the printing style didn't resemble his either. These were important building blocks, adding to the credibility of my suspicions. Michael Moore called me the night of the 18th. We're going to fire the first of the big guns tomorrow, he said, and then read me the text of Berkowitz's letter to Dunleavy. In it, Berkowitz was still following the party line. He called Sam Carr one of the devils of Satan, a force beyond the wildest imaginations of people. He is not human. The dog, of course, was a demon from hell. Then Berkowitz gave Dunleavy what he was looking for. When I killed, I really saved many lives. You will understand later. People want my blood, but they don't want to listen to what I have to say. There are other sons out there. God help the world. I wasn't overly thrilled with the letter's contents. He sounds just as... He sounds just as crazy as the cop says he is. I think it's an act. So what good are we going to do printing this? Michael Moore explained that the letter would provide a basis for raising the questions about the handwriting and composition ability. This gives us an opportunity to go into these things. And Berkowitz did say there were other sons of Sam. Michael Moore was true to his word. The next day, the Post hit the newsstands with a banner headline, Berkowitz warns of more sons. Letter to Post suggests accomplice. The handwriting issue was addressed, the possibility of a co-conspirator was mentioned, and Dunleavy managed to squeeze an admission from a police source that officials haven't had a real chance to question. Berkowitz. And then the police discredited the article. The Post had dared to swim against the tide. We told them privately about John Carr in the graphics studio, and they said they'd look into it. But I don't think they will, Michael Moore lamented. They shafted us, and now they're pissed off that we went with this piece. What now? I wanted to know. Did the hospital guy get to ask Berkowitz any of those questions yet? No, but he's working on it. Look, Maury, the cops are going to deny anything we come up with now. We're going to have to lay low until we get something they can't shoot down. You stay in touch with Steve, and I'll let you know when we hear from Kings County. I was somewhat disappointed by the outcome of what was essentially a trial balloon story, but I wasn't despondent. At least the questions were raised publicly. More work could bring more results. An hour later, I spoke to Dunleavy, who carried the cause to a couple of morning TV talk shows as well. We did what we could, mate. I'm convinced there's something to all this. We've got to keep plugging on it. Just stay the hell out of cemeteries, will ya? It's a big puzzle, Steve. I'm only looking for the right pieces to fit. Who the hell knows where they'll be? You may be right. But for now, forget the tangents. You got the John Carr thing. Focus on that. He's your all the way. Dunleavy was right, but I was having no luck in the search for John Carr. The game had now evolved into one with the authorities on one side, us on the other. So I wasn't about to approach the Yonkers police for assistance, and Michael Moore already recited the weather report from the NYPD frigid. Still, I had to do something and decided to delve into the Son of Sam letters once more and keep an eye on Pine Street and the Carr house. I didn't really know what I was looking for, but planned to take down license numbers and observe anything else which might prove to be valuable or lead to the elusive John Wheaties. The next day, September 20th, an event occurred in Yonkers which received no publicity. I wouldn't learn of it for more than 2 years. Its implications are considerable. Andrew Dupay, 33, lived on Lincoln Terrace, less than a block from Berkowitz and the Carrs. Dupay was a family man. He was married to the former Laurie Heaton and was the father of 2 young daughters, aged 5 and 3. Dupay worked as a mailman, and he not only lived in the Pine Street neighborhood, he also delivered the mail there to Berkowitz's building. The two houses on Wicker Street and the car home, among others, stated another way. He lived and toiled in a war zone. It is not known if Andrew Dupay read the Berkowitz article in the Post the day before. If he did, it may have affected him, but he may not have read it, because since early summer something had been troubling him, occupying his mind. An outgoing, cheerful young man who reveled in his family, Dupay suddenly began to act frightened and worried in July. His family noticed the change, as did his co-workers. He said nothing to his wife, but told a couple of friends at work that he had a big problem. Dupay said he feared for his life. It just wasn't like him at all. He was not a paranoid person by nature. He said he was afraid for his life, but he never said why, said one associate who requested anonymity. Because of his managerial position in the Postal Service. Dupay's mother-in-law, Mary Heaton, told me in 1981, it was all so strange, so unlike him. There was no history of mental or physical problems. He didn't gamble, the marriage was fine, and he lived for his family. In July and August he began to act fearful and edgy, but he wouldn't say why. There was, perhaps, a strong clue contained in a letter sent to Gannett Westchester Rockland newspaper after I began publishing articles about the conspiracy. The writer, who was a neighborhood resident on Dupay's route, said, "One day in July, he told me, sometimes a mailman learns things about the people on his route he'd better off not know. And he sees things he'd better off not see." Dupay, the writer added, did not explain what he meant. On September 20th at about 5:30 p.m., Dupay and Maury were bathing their two young daughters. Dupay excused himself, saying he was going to the basement to bring up something for the girls. At the bottom of the stairs, Dupay wrote a brief note. He then took a shotgun and killed himself. Yikes. It was only later we learned from his friends at work that he said he was afraid for his life, Mary Heaton said. In late August, about 2 weeks after Berkowitz's arrest, Dupay drew very close to Maury and the girls closer than usual. Mary Heaton recalled, he took them on a fishing trip then. He usually went on those vacations without them. Dupay apparently didn't want to leave his family alone. In his suicide note, he left another clue to his dilemma, remembering that day at Glen Island with his Italian family. I think that it's their doing. Glen Island is a Westchester County park located on the shore of Long Island Sound in New Rochelle. In June, 3 months before his death, Dupay, Maury, and the children were in a picnic area where grills were provided for public use. An Italian family was gathered in the grove at the same time, and they and Dupay got into an argument over who had first rights to a particular grill. It was a minor argument, and it was forgotten, said Mary Heaton. I can't believe he thought it went back to that. Indeed, it stretches plausibility to think that Dupay's life was mysteriously threatened by people he didn't even know a month and longer after a verbal spat about a barbecue. It's possible Dupay believed this was the source of the threats, but not likely. A more revealing insight was contained in that letter from the neighbor on his mail route, a route Dupay strode daily to 35 Pine Street, Wicker Street, and 316 Warburton Avenue. That note, quoting Dupay's own words, related that something he'd seen or learned along his rounds had frightened him, and the timing of all these events, so proximate to Berkowitz's arrest, is also telling. Then there was yet another letter mailed to me. I'd have contacted the Yonkers police with the information I have, but I think you know as well as I it would have been another mistake, considering the force employs 2 members of the Carr family, sister Wheat and brother-in-law John McCabe, then Wheat's husband and a Yonker police officer. The mailman, Andrew, I forgot his surname, knew them, the Carrs and Berkowitz, and this was never brought out. He committed suicide a few years ago after a meeting with an unnamed man in the Pelham Bay Park area of the Bronx. He said they were threatening him, the they is unknown, and were going to get his family. Shortly after, she found him dead of a bullet wound. The unnamed man Dupace was said to have met with in the Bronx remains unidentified. The letter writer had nothing more to offer about that incident. Dupace's co-workers were aware that he feared for his own life, but he hadn't mentioned threats were also directed at his family, as stated in the letter. But Dupace's actions prior to his death lend credence to that statement. He took them away on a fishing vacation when he usually went without them. He withheld telling his wife about any threats at all, and in the final moments of his life he was bathing his 2 daughters, hardly the impetus for immediate suicide. But it is reasonable to suggest that being with them and his wife in that intimate, loving situation may have overwhelmed him with a very real dread that something might imminently happen to them, and he took his own life to protect them. Why Dupace didn't report the threats to the police is unknown. He may have believed police protection would be inadequate or of short duration. It may have been for a more sinister reason. What could Andrew Dupace have seen or learned on his mail route to put him in such jeopardy, to convince him to take the threat so seriously that he would take his life rather than attempt to resolve the situation in another way? It will be remembered that the threatening letters were flying all over that neighborhood that spring and summer, sent through the mail and delivered by Dupace, and perhaps other correspondence which identified senders was also received. It is also possible Dupace observed culpable people coming and going from a particular residence, or saw Berkowitz in their company. Also, in 1983, a human skull, that of an unidentified elderly male, would be found in a wooded area across the street from Dupace's house. The skull's presence at the site would be dated to the approximate time of Dupace's death. Its origin would remain unknown, but it may have been stolen from a cemetery and used in rituals. And in the summer of 1986, the head of another elderly man was stolen from a coffin in a nearby Mount Vernon funeral home. Whether the incidents are related isn't known, but to this point, no one knows what or who it was that Andrew Dupace encountered on his postal route. Someday the answer may be found. In the meantime, a widow and children are left to wonder why he is dead. Over the next 2 months I pursued a variety of leads, none of which proved fruitful. I was just beginning to consider the occult references in the Sam letters when Michael Moore finally called with the news I'd been waiting for. Our contact got us a few answers from Berkowitz. I think you'll be pleased with what he came up with. Come on, Peter. I've been waiting a long time. Don't make me jump through the phone to find out. I was affecting a casual attitude, but was splitting apart inside. Michael Moore thought me too impatient, and I wasn't about to stoke his fire. I had endured a long wait, and had grown increasingly pessimistic as various courtroom proceedings continued. Berkowitz was at first found incompetent to stand trial by a team of psychiatrists who gobbled up his demon story. Later, He was tested again, this time largely through the analysis of Dr. David Abrahamson. Yeah, Dr. David Abrahamson, who was hired by Brooklyn DA Eugene Gold. He was ruled capable of assisting in his defense. Abrahamstein didn't buy the demon take at all. Not that they were not that Not that there was going to be anything resembling a real defense. Berkowitz's attorneys intended to plea their client not guilty by reason of insanity. But the battle of the psychiatrists was being waged. A transcript of Berkowitz's sessions with the doctors was obtained and published by the Daily News. The documents read like excerpts from a witch doctor's cookbook. Dogs, demons, blood, monsters, etc. As I read them, my heart sank. I believed the situation was getting too far out of hand. That was why I was anxious to hear from Michael Moore. I wanted to balance the private Berkowitz with the public one. Well, Michael Moore said, pausing for effect, he says Berkowitz answered that there were messages of some kind in the letter, but he won't say what they were. Berkowitz also refused to answer any questions about whether he actually wrote the letters or not. Unreal, I said. Michael Moore continued, he also won't answer your questions about whether or not he was alone at the Brooklyn shooting. What do you mean he won't answer? What did he say? He asked several times on several different occasions. Each time he said he wouldn't talk about that he didn't want to go into it. But he didn't say he was alone, and why are you asking me that stupid question? No, I think that says a lot, like ducking the questions about who wrote the Breslin letter. Yes, I agree with that, Michael Moore said, but it isn't proof yet. We don't have enough to print it. I understand, Peter. What about John Carr? This is the best of all. He was handed a slip of paper. Written on it was, "We know you're involved with John Carr." Berkowitz read it, turned white as a sheet, fell back on his cot, and looked like he was going to faint. Holy shit, this is a home run city, Peter. Did they say anything after that? No. There was a concern he might need medical assistance for a minute, but he recovered and wouldn't say a word. After a few more minutes of related conversation, I asked Michael Moore what we'd be doing next. We keep trying to get our hands on Carr, and we'll see if Berkowitz has anything else to say. I next heard from Peter Michael Moore at noon on Friday, December 2nd. I've got someone here I think you should get together with, he said. I think the time has come. We're about ready to drop the other shoe. What other shoe? I asked. It involves Casada, Jack Casada, the new Rochelle landlord. Well, it's connected to him in some way, Michael Moore answered. I'm not saying it's him directly. Let me put this person on here. Who is it? Is it the guy from the hospital? Yes, his name is Jim. Jim Midigar was my age, 31. He'd been a member of the New York City Police Department for 3 years before resigning to pursue what he'd always wanted to be his career, that of an investigative reporter. After a brief conversation on the telephone, I gave him directions to White Plains, and he arrived at the apartment at 3 p.m. Initially, he was as suspicious of me as I was of him. But as the afternoon turned into twilight, we began to feel more comfortable with one another. I was afraid they sent you up here as a plant to find out what I haven't told them, I said. Midigar laughed. I thought they were setting me up by sending me up here to see you. I knew about you, but I didn't know who you were. They never told me, I said. Yeah, They told me that they had some top contact in Westchester who was supplying them with these questions and the information about Carr, but I didn't know who you were either. The mysterious man from the hospital, finally, I said. Here, I received a surprise. Midigar wasn't actually the hospital source, someone else was in the picture too. Midigar, when a member of the police department had been assigned to the Kings County Hospital area, as a result, he knew his way around the facility, knew how it functioned. After Berkowitz's arrest, that same night, he'd gone to the hospital, reasoning that Berkowitz would be incarcerated there. Midigar wasn't working a conspiracy angle at first. Instead, he hoped to provide the media with tidbits about Berkowitz's routine. I found a source, he said. A source who agreed to help me if Berkowitz was sent there. I went to the Post, told them what I had, and we began to work together. Then you came along. Midigar wouldn't reveal the name of his contact. He's got access to Berkowitz, and he's reliable. That's all I can say. I asked if the Berkowitz comments, as repeated to me by Michael Moore, were accurate. Hell yes. And he did almost keel over when that John Carr thing was put to him. My source thought for a minute they'd have to call the doctors. So, the source isn't a doctor, I said? No, but look, I can't tell you. I decided the contact was either a guard or an orderly, but didn't voice my opinion to Midigar. How do I know he exists at all? I asked instead. Midigar reached into a travel case and pulled out an assortment of letters, copies that were plainly written by Berkowitz since his arrest. Some requests to religious organizations asking for material on demonology. Another was a note to Mayor Abe Beam, warning of the dangers of Sam. Okay, I said. You're on the level. Now, what's this about, Jack Casada from New Rochelle? Midigar explained that Casada, from whom Berkowitz rented a room in early 1976, was a co-worker of Fred Cowan, an avowed neo-Nazi who murdered 6 people before killing himself during a day-long siege at the Neptune Moving Company in New Rochelle on Valentine's Day 1977. Moreover, Berkowitz kept a file of new clippings on Cowan in his Yonkers apartment, and had referred to him as one of the sons. Did you know that? Midigar asked. Yes, I found that out in August. I've been saying up here that if I was Casada, I'd have written a first-person article for Reader's Digest on my most unforgettable characters. Midigar laughed and then turned serious. What do you think the odds are that one guy, Casada, would have Son of Sam living in his house and work with Fred Cowan during the day, and then have Berkowitz with a file on Cowan I'd cut in? I'd say the odds were incalculable, and we don't know how the hell Berkowitz ended up finding Casara's place either. Midigar was on the edge of his seat now. Maybe Cowan knew from Casada the room was available, and that's how Berkowitz found out. It makes sense. It's certainly plausible. I think there's a lot of smoke there, and there just might be a fire to go with it. Midigar and I agreed that if the scenario was correct, Jack Casada, then in his mid-60s, was almost certainly an innocent link between the two murderers. But we also concurred that it was too much to think there was no connection between Cowan and Berkowitz, especially in light of Berkowitz's comments about the Hitler-worshipping killer. Minigar didn't surprise me with the Cowan information, but there was more to come. Reaching into his bag again, he pulled out a handful of pictures. Take a look at these. The photos were of a familiar figure, Berkowitz, but these weren't police photos. There was Berkowitz in hospital garb, sitting on his cot. Another showed Berkowitz writing at a table in what appeared to be a day room. Yet another showed the alleged killer fast asleep on the cot in his cell. Others were variations of the same poses. Some were even in color. Where the hell did you get these? Stanford Memorial Church, site of brutal Stanford murder. Arliss Perry, bride of only 8 weeks. I don't know how much farther this chapter's going. Son of Sam, Stacy Moskowitz up top. Christine Freund on the bottom. I haven't read those yet. The Slayer of Donna Loria, top left. The Lomino de Massey shooter in the middle of the top. The Lomino de Massey shooter on the right. Ski cap from the Voskeri chain homicide. The Berkowitz look-alike Voskeri chain murder. The middle. Unreleased profile sketch of Moskowitz Violante gunman. Middle right. Unreleased sketch of yellow VW driver at Moskowitz scene. Note the long hair. Bottom left. Bottom middle. Profile of compromised Moskowitz/Violante sketch released to public. And bottom right, front view of compromised sketch as it appeared on page 1 of New York Daily News. Not much looking like Berkowitz. Under arrest, smiling David Berkowitz is escorted by NYPD Detective John Falatosio. In bold red type, the New York Post flashed the news of the arrest. The Pine Street neighborhood in Yonkers, Berkowitz apartment building, is in the background. His windows were on the top floor, right near the rear of the fire escape. The descending road at the right, Wicker Street. A German Shepherd was shot and a firebomb tossed at the house at the top of Wicker. At the bottom left, the White House with the garage-like structure behind it is the car house. On Warburton Avenue behind the car property is the Croton Aqueduct path where slain German Shepherds were found before, and well after Berkowitz's arrest, the Aqueduct path continued left to Untermeyer Park, about a mile from the Pine Wicker area. Oh, Sam sleep. They got a picture of him sleeping. Okay, this is more juicy. This occult symbol drawn by a 19th century black magician was linked to the Son of Sam right in late 1977. The key area on the original was near the X. The center, further a Berkowitz nickname Burke, was contained in Berkalale, and Sam Carr's name spelled backwards. A common satanic practice was hidden in Amasarak cars on the circumference of the original sign. Azaradel, Akibiel, Berkael, Amazarak. Oh, here's John Carr. Damn, this one's still going. Son of a bitch. Body identified as John Carr's, as found in North Dakota police. Note position of the rifle. Yeah, you kill yourself, but the rifle's at your feet. I don't know. Body identified as John Carr's, turned over by police. Note blood smudges on the wall and apparent blood writing on baseboard. On Carr's hand, although not visible in this photo, the remnants of the number 666 appeared carved into the drying blood. Guy got fucked up. Okay, almost done. The source, Midigar replied, with a tiny spy camera. For what purpose? For the Post. They're going to run them on Monday, along with some of those diary notes you saw. Suddenly dawn broke in my mind. Jim, as soon as these pictures are published, they're going to be a stink, the likes of which you've never seen. Berkowitz has been talking to your source. After this, no one is going to be able to get near him. We'll blow our access and whatever progress we can make. There'll be a goddamned investigation of this. Midigar wasn't so sure. My source is pretty well insulated, and besides, I don't run the Post. If they want to print them, they print them. I disagreed. All these months, they've kept us apart until today. Why today? Don't you see? They know the party's over. They know we'll be losing access to Berkowitz, so they figure there's nothing to lose by putting us together now. Midigar wasn't concerned. You're set in a full-time job, and that's fine for you. My goal is to get a job at the Post and to help solve this case if I can. I think there will be a small storm over this, and then I'll die down and we'll get to Berkowitz again. I knew that Berkowitz, who wasn't facing the camera in any of these shots, wasn't aware the photos were taken, so he couldn't be of assistance to any investigation. Not that he would have cooperated anyway. He likes my source. They get along. He calls him Sly Fox 1, and I'm known as Sly Fox 2. Don't sweat it, Midigar added. I don't think it's a good idea, but I understand where you're coming from. I just wish to hell there was another way. Anyway, it looks like it's going to be you and me from now on. I guess we'll start on Cowan and, of course, John Carr. Midigar said he'd drive up from his Staten Island home the next week, and together we'd begin to look into some leads in New Rochelle. Then I'd like you to take me down to see Berkowitz's place and the neighborhood there, he said. No problem. I've gotten to know the block pretty well lately. I'll give you a call Monday, Midigar said. Don't worry about the pictures. It'll all work out right. On a scale of 1 to 10, the explosion was a 12. On Monday morning, as the metropolitan area groggily shook itself awake, its citizens peeked in on Berkowitz, who was still dozing away in a blissful dreamland, in a huge photo that covered the entire front page of the Post. Above the picture was a large headline, Sam Sleeps. Inside, in a 2-page spread, the other photos of Berkowitz I'd seen were displayed in a layout enhanced with excerpts from his jailhouse writings. Of course, the usual photo credits were missing from their customary place beneath the pictures. Official reaction was swift as several investigators were launched into this blatant breach of security. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, the Department of Correction, and the State Special Prosecutor's Office, responsible for ferreting out official corruption, all entered the fray. Media response was likewise intense. Critics castigated the Post for a tawdry sensationalism, and some publications almost gleefully reported that probes into Operation Photo had begun. One out-of-town paper even superimposed a rifle on the picture of the sleeping Berkowitz to illustrate the possible consequences of such dire security lapses. I called Michael Moore late in the afternoon. You were looking for a big Berkowitz story, and I guess you sure got one, Peter. Christ, we didn't expect this kind of reaction. All we did was print some pictures and notes. Well, I guess you could say you were framed, I suggested. Michael Moore didn't appreciate the pun, but I felt he had it coming. He quickly changed the subject. What did you think of that, Jim? I liked him. He's been a cop, street smart. He knows his way around. We'll get along fine. One thing, though, we don't think Casada is dirty. We think he might have been an innocent link between the two of them. Yeah, that's what I thought too. Keep at it and let me know how you're doing. I've got to get going. It's a little hectic here, as you probably can imagine. I stood looking at a dead phone. Although I was dismayed at the obvious loss of access to Berkowitz, I didn't say to Michael Moore I thought Peter might have been squeezed on the photo deal, pressured to run with the story. Whether or not Michael Moore was responsible, one thing was clear. Someone at the Post, tired of the conspiracy search, which had yet to produce printable results, and opted instead for the big sleep. I turned on the 6 o'clock news, and there again was Sleeping Sam. In spite of myself, the image of all those officials scampering about like so many little Dutch boys trying to plug a leaking security dike brought a grin to my face. But after a few minutes, I realized I'd reached a turning point and began to reflect on what transpired since August. I entered the case a wide-eyed, eager neophyte. I had, in fact, uncovered a considerable amount of information despite being restricted to part-time work on the case. That was a plus. I'd also gone from completely outside the media and investigation to the inside. But still, during those 4 months, I'd stumbled through a lot of learning mistakes. I was right about the Brooklyn killings, right about John Carr, and perhaps Michael Carr. Right about the authorship of the Breslin letter. I knew I was. I was on the brink of being capable of breaking open a story of immense proportions. But what did I have to show for it? Nothing, except the knowledge that I have to continue to build a stronger case and a sneak preview of Berkowitz doing a Sealy mattress commercial. It was time to put this recent battlefield education to work and to stop circling around the case as if I was content just to be part of it. If the Post wanted to be serious, fine. If not, there'd be another way of getting the story out. I reached for a pad and composed a short list. Find John Carr, get with Midigar and Cowan, check occult references in Sam letters. 3 items, only 3, but within the next 8 weeks there would be major developments in 2 of them, developments which would greatly expand the scope of the case. I was sliding the list into a briefcase when the doorbell rang. I wasn't in the mood for business. I'd called George Austin and was on the way to meet him for a drink at Oliver's in White Plains, a favorite oasis of ours. I put on my coat and headed for the stairs. As the bell rang, it was my neighbor, Tom Bartley, the news editor from the Gannett papers. Ho ho, he smiled, squinting in the darkened doorway. What might you happen to know about a certain set of pictures published in your favorite paper today? Well, you caught me. I took them a year ago on a movie set. Even then I knew what he was involved in, and I wanted to be ready ahead of time. He graciously offered to pose. He's a fine gentleman. You didn't really think they were taken at Kings County Jail. Kings County, did you? Tom laughed. Nah, I thought you hired a stand-in. You son of a bitch. You do know something, don't you? Tom, I had nothing to do with the taking of those pictures. That was a true statement. Look, I'm going down to Oliver's to have a pop with George. Why don't you come along? I want to talk to you about the occult. So now you're after those dead dogs. Something like that. You think Rip Van Winkle was in a cult? I don't know yet. Maybe he was, indeed. Long chapters this book has, my goodness.